I think it's worth just talking about the personal and physical toil on your fame, really. How many times have you been in hospital and how many times have you been arrested? Give us some statistics.
Well, I've been involved in more than 3,000 direct action protests over the last 60 years. I've been arrested or detained by the police more than 100 times. And I've been subjected to over 300 violent assaults, including 50 attacks upon my home, such as mostly bricks and bottles through the windows, but also 3 arson attacks, and even a live bullet through my letterbox. So yeah, it's been quite tough, but I'm still here.
Greetings, and my name is Mark Borkowski, and welcome to another edition of my podcast called The Fame Formula. This edition is a candid chat with the remarkable Peter Tatchell, one of Britain's most renowned and influential human rights campaigners. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but for 6 decades, Peter has challenged governments, dictators, religious authorities, and the powerful institution in pursuit of LGBT plus equality, democracy, and global justice. From helping stage Britain's first Pride March way back in 1972 to confronting people like Robert Mugabe and Mike Tyson. In this chat, Peter candidly talks about the issues that protest face today and how we're slipping back into more draconian laws that are stopping people expressing and protesting for human rights and for equality. So sit back and listen. And I hope if any of you, and goodness knows there might be some young listeners here that won't know about Peter Tatchell, I think at the end of this podcast, you'll have a glimpse of what is an extraordinary human being.
Greetings, Peter. I'm going to embarrass you now by a very should we say, oleaginous sort of introduction, which I think you deserve. So welcome to the Fame Formula podcast. Thank you for agreeing to speak to me. As you know, I'm a huge fan, and actually we stretch back when I produced my book in propaganda. I think that's the first time you called me back in 1999, rightly to ask, after the book has been printed, by the way, why didn't you include me? Which was an error, which I shall never forget. But I wish I could afford to produce the book in a second edition. But you know, it is without doubt you are one of the most renowned and influential global human rights campaigners, and you've been at this, Peter, for I looked it up, 6 decades. That's nearly as long as me, and you've been the epitome of bravery. You know, you've challenged governments, dictators, religious authorities, you know, and really powerful institutions in the pursuit of LGBT rights and equality and democracy and global justice. And your wonderful documentary produced by Elton John and David Furnish, which is no longer, I regret to find, on the Netflix platform, so we must petition those idiots to put it back on, is that I loved Stephen Fry's quote, is that you've helped so many people live a fulfilled life, I'm paraphrasing now, that don't even know you and don't even know what you've done to help them. And, you know, from gay pride in the 70s through to tackling Mugabe and, of course, who can forget Mike Tyson, you've done more than most, numerous awards. And so I just want to tackle a couple of things before we go back to your deep, dark past, leaving a homophobic 60s Australia behind in 1967. I think it's worth just talking about the personal and physical toil on your fame, really, in terms of your health issues. I mean, you know, how many times have you been in hospital and how many times have you been arrested? Give us some statistics.
Well, I've been involved in more than 3,000 direct action protests over the last 60 years. I've been arrested or detained by the police more than 100 times. And I've been subjected to over 300 violent assaults, including 50 attacks upon my home, such as mostly bricks and bottles through the windows, but also 3 arson attacks, and even a live bullet through my letterbox. So yeah, it's been quite tough, but I'm still here.
Well, thank God. And would you describe yourself as brave?
Not really. Well, I suppose I take more risks than many people do, but I think of the millions who served to defend this country against Nazism during the Second World War. They were really brave. They were battling bombs and bullets. I haven't had to deal with that level of threat and violence.
So here you are. You're born in Melbourne. You came from pretty working class family. You weren't born with a silver spoon in your mouth, but I think it's worth telling perhaps a younger generation just how difficult it was for someone who realised they were gay in the 1960s in Australia. Give us a sense of what that country was like then.
Well, in that era, homosexuality was still totally illegal in all circumstances. You could be sentenced to several years imprisonment, and in some cases even incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital in a bid to cure you. That's how bad it was. But when I was growing up, there were no LGBT organisations, no helplines, no counselling services, no switchboards, and definitely no campaigning groups. So when I realised I was gay in 1969 at the age of 17, I was all on my lonesome. I eventually did meet some gay people, and I even suggested we got to fight back against this oppression. We have to demand decriminalisation, protection against discrimination, and so on. But they were mostly a bit older, and they just thought, what do you know? You're 17 years old. Go away. You'll get us all arrested. So all I could do was write letters to the press or to members of parliament.
So you did raise your head above the parapet then?
Yeah, but I've got to tell you, the first few times I never dared sign my name, let alone give my address, because I feared the letter might be handed to the police and I'd get a knock on the door.
So what was the decision to leave Australia and come to England? What motivated you? Because it wasn't very, back in the 60s, you couldn't say that London was very liberal toward homosexuality, would you?
Well, it was more liberal because there had been a partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, but only in England and Wales in 1967. But yeah, the motivation for coming was I'd always wanted to travel, to see other countries' cultures. But the real impetus was that Australia was fighting in Vietnam alongside the Americans, and there was the draft. I politically and morally objected to the war. I objected to the way in which Australia and America were propping up a corrupt dictatorship in South Vietnam and committing horrendous war crimes, including the mass bombing of civilian villages. So I was refusing to register for the draft, and if I'd maintained that position, I would have faced 2 years imprisonment. Now, initially, I did think about, going to prison for the cause, but this coincided with me falling in love for the first time and meeting a wonderful person, and the idea of us being torn apart, me being in prison for 2 years, that was just too much for me to bear. So I came to London.
And what did you find in London? What was your journey in London then? You arrived in London in 67. Where did the activism, where did the sort of the need to start? What were you seeing, and why did you feel that this inspiration came for you to start on your journey of activism?
Well, of course, unlike Australia and Melbourne, there was a very vibrant LGBT plus movement, the Gay Liberation Front, which had not long been established in London. And so arriving in London and being able to be part of that movement was an incredibly personally liberating experience. It made my letter writing back in Australia seem so pathetic. So I was involved very quickly in that movement, but also I was involved in lots of other social movements against racism, against apartheid, and against British troops in Ireland. I mean, long before the Good Friday Agreement, I was arguing for a negotiated political settlement to end the war in the north of Ireland. So I was a bit of an outlier.
But I mean, that's a lot to take on. Here's a young man, what in your sort of late teens,
19,
early 20s,
19.
19, not even 20. It's a lot to take on. Where did that sort of that desire to stand up come from? You know, I think we all have our rebellious sort of phase, and we stand by things that are important to us, and you know, we go on marches. I was very active in anti-racism, you know, particularly when I saw the rise of the National Front. You know, but you know, this thing is sustained, and you've become incredible. You know, you've become the byword. You are the probably the most famous activist who actually has understood not just activism but the power of the press. You've put yourself, as you talked about there in terms of the statistics, you've put yourself on the line. Where did that come from? Because you know, you're up against a lot of things, and you've got this fire and desire, you know, for what you feel is right. That is a great fuel, a great power. Where does that drive come from? You know, I'm interested in that.
Well, my parents were working class evangelical Christians. My father was a lathe operator in an engineering factory. He worked shifts to get extra money. I hardly ever saw him. When my parents were divorced, later my mother remarried, and her new husband, my stepfather, was a brutal tyrant. He beat me over nothing. You know, the slightest little thing I did wrong or mistake I made, you know, I get a really bad beating. And he also was abusive towards my mother as well. But in those days, there was no women's aid or women's refuge, so we couldn't leave. You know, there was no support for battered women and their children. But that brutality of my stepfather, that gave me a burning sense of injustice, and that injustice was wrong. And then on top of that, my mother suffered from life-threatening asthma. She nearly died 8 times during my childhood. So at a time when there was no national health service in Australia, a lot of our limited, income went on medical bills, medicines, doctors, and so on, all of which you had to pay for back in those days. So we were very, very, very poor. And that was another sense of injustice that drove me. Why should we suffer because our mother had this life-threatening illness over which she and we had no control? But I think the really pivotal moment was in 1963, when I was 11 years old. I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered on a Sunday morning by white racists. Now, I was thousands of miles away. I'm white, but as an 11-year-old, I immediately knew that is so, so wrong. That's utterly appalling. So it prompted my interest in and support from afar for the Black Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. I followed all the struggles, all the marches, all the repression they suffered. And I was inspired by their courage, and really those tactics, those values, those ideals became my template. So when I came to do my first ever campaign in 1967, which was against the pending execution of a prisoner who had allegedly shot dead a prison warder during a jail escape, I applied those kind of tactics. And I worked out at the age of, 15, that he couldn't have fired the fatal shot because the bullet would have had to do a U-turn in midair. Because I read up about the autopsy report, which mentioned the trajectory of the bullet through the dead warder's body. So I got involved in doing direct action to try and stop his execution. Sadly, we failed. And that really shocked me. That radicalized me because I thought, I trust the government. I trust the police. I trust the judges. Yet here they are hanging a man who may well be innocent, or certainly the evidence did not support beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty. So those were radicalizing influences. And then, of course, when I learned about what Australia and the United States were really doing in Vietnam, the mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, the torture, the tiger cages, the Conson tiger cages, where political prisoners were being tortured, I just thought, this government, which I had trusted and believed was to serve the people, I became angry and involved. I got involved in the Vietnam Moratorium campaign. And in 1970, we organized a general strike against the Vietnam War, or against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Only we didn't call it a general strike because we knew that would turn off a lot of people. We wanted to bring everybody to downtown Melbourne to protest the war. So the slogan was, "Stop work to stop the war." And on that day in late 1970, nearly 100,000 people, almost 10% of the entire population of Melbourne, turned out to protest the war. And that was a real turning point, because the government realized for the first time the mass revulsion of Australian people against what we were doing with the Americans in Vietnam. And that led eventually to Australia's withdrawal and indeed the scrapping of the draft.
It's incredible when you think of that time. You were 14, 15. That is so young to be involved. So in some ways, what do you think about the currency now of action and the sort of pressures? Let's talk about Palestine action in terms of how people now are or even environmental protests that are going on, post Extinction Rebellion and the direct action on buildings and whatever, and the imprisonment of very young people. I mean, if we take the smashing of the Barclays Bank in the city, some very young people were incarcerated for that action. Do you feel now in this country, given what you've done, but someone being so famous for that activism, do you think it's more difficult now to find a voice? Have the authorities learned how to deal with people like yourself?
Well, there's no doubt whatsoever that we are witnessing a steady erosion of the right to protest and free speech. That's incontrovertible. The number of restrictions the police now place on protests is many times more than 20, 30 or 40 years ago. And, I don't agree with violence, but it's clearly absurd to equate Palestine action as terrorists on a par with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. That's clearly a nonsense. And in the ruling in the appeal court, the judges defended Elbit Systems, the Israeli weapons makers, saying they were a lawful business, and implicitly saying they had a lawful right to make weapons to supply a genocide. But people who took direct action to disrupt and damage their operations to prevent a genocide, they were terrorists. This is 1984. This is what George Orwell could have written.
Do you think that your fame protects you now, in the sense that when Peter Tatchell takes up arms in a minute, that you are slightly untouchable, where a sort of someone who's protesting, who's, let's call it, unknown, doesn't have your level of fame, have more difficulty? Or do you think it's just a different attitude now that people turn to use social media more for their voice, where you literally knew that the action you drove, that stunt, that political outrage stunt, generated the headlines and the front pages?
I think I have some degree of protection, but not entirely. So on the 17th of May in 2025, I attended the Palestine Solidarity March with a placard condemning both Israel's genocide and Hamas's execution of Palestinian critics. I was arrested on charges of racially and religiously aggravated breach of the peace. I didn't insult or threaten anybody's race, or I didn't even mention anybody's race or religion. And I had to fight and fight and fight before the police eventually acknowledged that they'd made a mistake. In January 2026, I attended another Palestine protest with a slogan, "Globalize the Intifada, non-violent resistance, end Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank." Non-violent resistance was written in big black bold letters to show that I supported resistance by Palestinians, but non-violently. And I was making that issue because the criminalization of the word intifada has been made by the police without any parliamentary approval. That is not an offence in law, and particularly when you're calling for non-violent intifada, like strikes, marches, civil disobedience, protests, which I was, it's monstrous that the police could treat this as a criminal offence. And then when the appeal court had their ruling that the ban on Palestine Action as a terrorist group was legitimate, I attended the protest to make the point that Palestine Action was seeking to uphold the law against genocide, whereas Israel and the British government were effectively aiding it. I asked, who are the real criminals? I was at that protest for 2 hours, and then I went to leave. I had an event to go to, so I went off walking up the street, walked way far away from the protest. I went into a coffee shop to get a coffee. I turned around and I was surrounded by police who demanded to see my placard and then demanded to film and photograph it. And then sort of implied that I might be hearing from them in future.
That's pretty scary, actually. That is pretty. When you put that together, that is pretty draconian, isn't it? I mean,
but this is nothing by comparison to what others have endured. I mean, there are people who've been in prison on remand for over a year for non-violent offences. That's just unconscionable. There are people who've had their homes raided, all their computers, laptops and phones confiscated, not for a day or two, but for months. Indeed, this happened to me in January. The police confiscated my phone. I had to get my lawyers to petition them to release the phone. They also imposed bail conditions that banned me from entering anywhere in central London. I couldn't attend my hospital appointment. I couldn't do interviews or public meetings. And again, I had to fight with my lawyers to get that overturned. So what's happened to me is just a tiny fragment of what is happening to many, many, many good people.
I mean, it's quite a thing to target you because actually you're vociferous. You have a platform, you have a voice, you have a history, have a legacy. Do you think the targeting of you is to send out messages to a certain extent, that if they could silence Peter Tatchell, be warned anybody else who are considering a sort of a life of activism?
Maybe, I don't know, but maybe.
I think I go back to, I think the first time I really became aware of you was, for me personally, when I first came to London in 1983, and, Bermondsey, when you stood in Bermondsey. I think it's worth going back to that slightly in Annals of History, because that was quite a moment where you stood. So talk about that a little bit. I think it's an interesting story for people listening to this.
Yeah, in 1981, I was selected as the Labour parliamentary candidate for the constituency of North Southwark and Bermondsey, which is along the south bank of the Thames, roughly from London Bridge around to Deptford. I had a vision, a radical vision. I was a radical left-winger. I made no bones about that. But I stood for policies like a national minimum wage, a comprehensive Equality Act to protect everyone against discrimination, and for a negotiated political settlement to the war in Ireland. On all those three counts, I was denounced as an extremist. And even the Labour Party eventually said, you're not allowed to discuss these issues anymore. So I also had a vision. Bermondsey had been badly bombed in the war. The docks had closed. Large areas were derelict. There was a lot of slum housing, some a little bit from the 19th century, but mostly from the 1920s, and some of the horrible 1960s gigantic slab block high-rise buildings. I had a vision to rebuild or redevelop Bermondsey as an urban garden city. Houses with gardens, neighbourhood parks, tree-lined streets. A sort of Letchworth on the Thames. Letchworth Garden City on the Thames. But, you know, I was savaged by the press, and there wasn't really any newspaper that really publicised much what I stood for. It was all that I was a Marxist extremist, a threat to British society, that I was gay and a pervert and abnormal, that I was an N lover, you know, pure and outright racism. Most commentators say that the Bermondsey by-election was the dirtiest, most violent, and definitely most homophobic election in Britain since the Second World War. And I think I can attest to that. You know, during the campaign, I was physically attacked over 100 times. There were 2 or 3 attempts to knock me off my bike when I was bicycling around the city. Bricks through the windows. Far-right activists published my name and home address. The police, gave me perfunctory coverage. You know, I was under. The perception was that I could be attacked and killed, yet the police refused to provide any 24-hour protection. They just said, "Oh, we'll walk past your flat once or twice in the night." But of course, the assailants aren't going to attack when the police are in the region or the area. They'll come back later. So, you know, I was living in fear.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, it
Absolutely terrifying.
And the Labour Party, you know, because I was a radical left-winger and there was a big battle between the left and the right, they gave negligible support to the campaign. Normally there's about 80 or 90 Labour Party organisers put into a constituency for a by-election. I got 12. 12 versus 90, 80 or 90. It was.
So did that put you off, you know, sort of, should we say, standing for parliamentary power? Did it put you off, you know, sort of being inside, let's say, legitimate political party? Did you see there was no hope for that, really, in a sense? You had to plough your own furrow, as it were.
Well, those who don't know, I lost the election in one of the biggest electoral swings of all time, which wasn't surprising because the tabloid Red Tops in particular, they had pretty much a story every week, a really negative, hostile, often fabricated story about me for the 18 months or 15 months in the run-up between my selection as the Labour candidate and the actual election date. So it really completely changed public perceptions because almost nothing positive was ever reported. So I lost.
But how did you come back from that? I mean, most people would have sort of crawled under a stone or given up or gone to live on a Welsh hill farm or whatever. I mean, you know, I'm fascinated by your resilience, you know, which is extraordinary. You know, it empowered you in some way. Would you say? I mean, you became more famous because of that defeat. To a certain extent, your activism was known. I can attest to the homophobia of which the Red Tops revelled in for many decades. It's only recently that's abated. But how did you come back? It gave you more fame, but where does, you know, that we talked about your upbringing and whatever, but here is a massive down. And I'm always interested. I always say to people, you learn a lot more from defeat and from crisis than you do from success. Success doesn't really teach you any lessons. Failure does. Was that part of what was going on then after Bermondsey?
Yeah, I guess I thought to myself, well, because of this notorious by-election, I now have a public platform. How can I use it to advance the causes that I feel passionately about? And so particularly because of the homophobia of that campaign, the extreme homophobia, I did put more energy into LGBT plus issues, but not exclusively, lots of other issues as well. So I thought to myself, well, it's all very well getting MPs elected, and I would have liked to have been elected. And in that absence, what can I do to help build a public momentum to change the law on X, Y, and Z? So I saw campaigning outside of Parliament as a way of raising awareness about issues of injustice and then putting pressure on Parliament to change the law. So I tried to turn the negative into a positive.
Well, that takes a huge amount of, as I said, sort of belief to a certain extent. I mean, would you say that ego was a big part of you? That being, I've met many people who are famous and been driven there because of their ego. In fact, there's a very famous American publicist who once told me that wherever ego, I go. And I think that's true, because to a certain extent that, do you have a huge ego, would you say, in the terms, or have you applied that ego to activism and your own fame, for the greater good as you see it?
Well, I remember Ian McKellen being asked that question, about my ego. And his response was, to do extraordinary things, you have to have an ego. Not an ego of self and self-aggrandizement, but an ego that you have a strong sense of belief and a determination and passion to make change happen. So for me, I don't want fame, but I do want to use what public profile I have to advance the causes that I feel passionate about. So for me, it's not so much important about what has Peter Tatchell done, but more what has Peter Tatchell and many others helped achieve.
Would you say you were, surely you must be conscious of your fame. There must have been a point where you must have addressed it in your head that, this is a superpower to a certain extent. It might be a burden as well, but it's a bit of a superpower, because I think, people who become famous for whatever reason don't truly recognize the power that's embodied with that, or don't respect it and don't nurture it in a way that can do other things. There's a sort of, sometimes there's a monetary value what people put on it, and we all see that now in terms of in terms of social media. I noticed that the heroic goalkeeper that last night that was playing for Cape Verde, who kept the Spanish out like some defender against the walls. By the end of the evening, he had 4.1 million followers on Instagram. I don't know what he's going to do with all those followers, but we can measure it now in a way that you couldn't measure it. But surely you could measure it on, being able to attract the media to a cause. For example, when you were looking at sort of religious hypocrisy and tackling at the pulpit the Archbishop of Canterbury, or you're facing up very bravely to Robert Mugabe and what was happening in Zimbabwe. You went on the front line, unarmed, but with possibly a piece of paper. That empowered you slightly, because it wasn't just the stunt, the outrage you were causing, activism, suffragette-like. Mm-hmm. You could do it because you were Peter Tatchell, and you knew that people would be magnetized to your action.
Yeah, I mean, when we set up Outrage, the LGBT plus direct action group in 1990, everybody knew that my involvement would increase the coverage that Outrage got for its various campaigns and protests. So I was instrumentalized. I was happily used to advance that cause. But for me, a protest is not an end in itself. A protest is a means to an end. So the protest I did in the 1970s with the Gay Liberation Front, in the 1990s with Outrage and many other organizations, they're all a means to an end. And the goal is to get media coverage, not for its own sake. You know, I'm not a media whore. I don't want media coverage for its own sake. I want the media coverage because it helps raise awareness about injustice. It alerts the public to discrimination. It creates momentum for change. And of course, the publicity also puts people in power under pressure to change. So if you write a letter to a government minister, that's a very private act and no one else knows about it. But if the government minister is confronted in the street or whatever, that gets media coverage and that puts him under pressure to respond to the claims that you're making to put something right.
It seems like a cycle. Whatever you've done, you know, there's more to do. There's never enough, is there? In terms of, and I think you've touched on it slightly. We seem to be going backwards, not forwards, as the media dissipates. You know, we've had a very more conscious and more, you know, some would argue a better tabloid media over the last, 10 years. Certainly, Leveson helped and outing a lot of the nefarious tactics that we used, which have been crushed. But we seem to be going back into an age now where we have more tyrants, worryingly, with more power and more platform. You know, Putin, we arguably have Trump. We have more and more people, crushing some of the advances. So we've got a certain amount of freedom here, to a certain extent, in terms of what you've achieved, in terms of people being able to live the life that they've chosen they want to be. Clearly around the world that's not quite the same, but somehow, particularly with the manosphere that seems to be growing, there's a sort of real sense of homophobia in the heart of that. Do you worry that we're going backwards after all the momentum that was created, the momentum that was created by you, and in terms of the tolerance that now exists here that certainly didn't exist certainly in the 80s and arguably some part of the 90s? Do you think we're railing back?
I think we made great progress in the late 90s and early 2000s. But since 2015, things have started to go in reverse. And I situate this moment with Brexit. Brexit led to unprecedented levels of social abuse on social media, a coarsening of public discourse, a coarsening of politics. It was compounded, I think, during COVID and the dispute over lockdowns. And now, of course, it's reignited around immigration and asylum. We definitely live in a less liberal society, a less tolerant society now than, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And that's really, really tragic. I will defend everybody's right to protest. I defended the Brexiteers. They often had big mass protests in London, which brought central London to a standstill. On one occasion, I couldn't get to hospital for an appointment because all the routes were blocked. But I didn't criticize them. I said, they've got a right to protest. I'll find a new way to get to the hospital. And I think this live and let live attitude, this ability to acknowledge people who are different, have a right to speak, have a right to protest, that is diminished. And that's diminished on both the right and sometimes on the left as well.
Yeah, for me, I personally despise, we've lost the ability to agree to disagree. I mean, there's some of my friends' whole views I don't cherish, but they've got a right to express them, and we can have a healthy debate, and we can sit back and sort of say, I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, but let's move on. That seems to be lost now. I mean, that, everybody has to be proved right in terms of what they stand for. And, arguments now become quite toxic and hostile. And people can get caught into, also can be used and deliberately provoked in some ways to ensure that people get cancelled for whatever their views. And I think that that for me personally is a tragedy, that we've lost the ability to have a healthy debate, and it's screechy. And I think that's an erosion of humanity in some ways, because I mean, and I think there's a lot of people make a lot of comments on the younger generation, particularly their concern over the planet and because of climate change, or and whatever, and they're diminished. And of course, from a PR point of view, I see, more and more big budgets going into astroturfing, going into reports, creating debates, and actually there isn't the media now to question it in the sort of way. There's not the same investigation, and things that I think have become, quality journalism has gone in many cases. Of course, there's great examples of that. Of course, there's great writers, and there's some, even if you're not on the traditional press, there's some fantastic Substacks out there, newsletters and whatever. But I think part of the problem is that we live in our little bubbles. You and I both inhabit a bubble. We're influenced by the information that comes in. That is a problem. So therefore, there's more need for us to bust open the bubbles. There's more need now, for other Peter Tatchells to come forward. And we've been talking about earlier on, the way that policing is existing now is to crush the future Peter Tatchells. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. But to deal with your further point, I think you're right. In the old days, it used to be 3 strikes and you're out. So you say or do 3 very bad things. On the 3rd one, yes, you get cancelled. Now it's 1 strike and you're out. And I just think that's so wrong. People make mistakes. That doesn't mean they're the devil and they should be cast out. My view was always, cure the sickness, save the patient. So there have been plenty of homophobes in the past who've changed their views, and I've welcomed them. I mean, Michael Portillo was voting against gay equality in the 1990s. He was in defense minister and witch hunting LGBT plus people out of the armed forces. I challenged him in the famous Kensington by-election. I harried him wherever he went to challenge the discriminatory policies he was pursuing. But after he got elected, then I noticed that he started voting for gay equality. So my response was to write a letter to him, thanking him for having a change of heart. And I think...
What was his response to that letter?
He was very appreciative and surprised. But
that's a human gesture. I mean, I think again we've lost, in an AI world of AI slop, for example, the greatest achievements, I think, of those people who have an ability to be human and actually, sort of promote humanity rather than forever getting some AI engine to compose something that feels human, which of course it's not. But do you help? Are you available for young activists to come? Do you have the time? I mean, because to carry on protesting, which you clearly, looking at issues, let's call it that, and sort of the issues, have you still got the energy for that? If you must be suffering from, I would say, the physical violence you've suffered. That must have had a long tail effect on you.
Yeah, I mean, I've been diagnosed, this is going back to the Bermondsey days and the violence there, with post-traumatic stress disorder, or as one of the doctors quipped, Peter Tatchell stress disorder, PTSD. And it has been very, very tough. Very tough. I've been attacked, as I said, over 300 times. There's been an attempt to throw me off a high-speed intercity train. Attacked by a gang of about 10 news on Coventry Station one night after speaking at a local meeting in the city. attacked at coming out of the local supermarket. For decades, I've been looking over my shoulder everywhere I go.
Did that make you stronger?
It made me more nervous and anxious. And
I mean, sure. I mean, you're human, so I assume that you do get you are frightened. It is
and people would often wonder why I never smiled much. It was this state of fear that I was in, never knowing when the next attack would come.
So where is your focus now? I mean, as you say, we're beginning to rail back on many of the of a liberal society that we perhaps are moving more towards, and now, as we've touched on, you're worried about that. You're worried about those freedoms. Where's your focus now? If you've got to choose your battles now in terms of your energy, do you have to remind people how important it is to stand up in a world that's more difficult, as we've said, to stand up? Where's your focus now?
We'll go back to your earlier question. Yes, I do force myself to make time for younger activists, to support, encourage and mentor them. Some of them get involved in my Peter Tatchell Foundation, and some are working on other campaigns which I support and advise them on, because it is really important that we have a new generation. I won't be around forever. I mean, I am 74, coming up to 75. I intend to carry on to my late 90s. I'm currently still working about 60 or 70 hours a week. But, it won't last forever. It won't last forever. So I'm conscious that I need to pass my knowledge and skills on to a new generation. So I've recently bequeathed my archive to the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. So it becomes a source for future activists, as well as historians and journalists and others. But to me, that's the most important thing about bequeathing that archive, is that so that new generations can learn about the campaigns I've done, how I did it, and then perhaps, if appropriate, adapt some of those ideas in the same way that I adapted the ideals and values of the Black Civil Rights Movement from the 1960s.
So what's your focus? We've touched on, I'd like to talk about, where we've just kicked off the World Cup. I believe that you have an action plan for the World Cup. Can you talk about it? Because we might be able to follow along, as you obviously are allowed into America, which of course is getting more difficult for people, particularly with your track record, should we say?
But I have a golden something or other up my sleeve. Donald Trump once retweeted one of my tweets. Bizarrely, it was about LGBT campaigning in India. And he tweeted, "Great." So I've got that on my phone, ready to show immigration if they try and stop me at the border. But yeah, campaign-wise, my foundation, we are highlighting, among many other things, the fact that 11 World Cup teams would never allow a gay footballer to be selected for their team, no matter how brilliant he was. That's because they are homophobic regimes, homophobic teams, and that is against FIFA's rules.
11 participating teams in the World Cup.
Yeah.
What are those 11? I mean, Egypt, I assume, Iran?
Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Uzbekistan, Algeria. There's quite a list.
Wow.
Now, even if their number one star player was gay or suspected of being gay, they would never be selected for the World Cup team. They'd be more likely put in prison. And FIFA's rule state categorically that at no stage in the selection or participation for the World Cup are any of the teams or the countries allowed to discriminate on race, gender, and sexual orientation. So they're clearly in violation of FIFA rules.
So what's the shape of the protest going to take then? What have you planned?
I can't go into the details, but I will be there to try and make an impact, to highlight this discrimination, which FIFA seems to be allowing. On top of that, it's a the sort of money and the sponsors and the scale
of this World Cup is second to none. Let's not even talk about the seat prices for those people who can afford to go. There's likely to be quite a lot of security around that. These days, there is a, as we talked about now, is it more dangerous than it ever was before to take the type of direct action you have been involved with over your 5 or 6 decades? Do you feel that there's more trigger happy police in America? We've seen what's happened with the ICE protests and whatever. You're stepping into, would you say, a more dangerous world to stage your activism?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people have said, be very careful about what you do. The police and the public have guns, and not just at potential risk from being shot by the police, although I think it's probably unlikely, but there are crazy fans who have guns. So, it's I'm very, very, very nervous, but I think in order to expose this clear violation of FIFA rules and this outrageous discrimination by these 11 teams against gay or potential gay players, I have to take a risk. Otherwise it won't get coverage.
Because you took action around Qatar, didn't you, in terms of the hypocrisy of some of the leading sorts of figures that supported Qatar. And I can't remember, did you take action in Moscow as well? I can't remember. Yeah. You did.
Yeah, in both in Moscow in 2018 at the World Cup on the opening day, I staged a protest out just by the Kremlin, calling out.
You were violently attacked, as I remember, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, and calling out Putin's failure to stop the killings of gay people in Chechnya, and then repeated that in Qatar, in Doha, Qatar, in 2022, when I stood outside the National Museum with the big signs condemning Qatar's jailing and forced conversion of LGBT plus people. Both occasions I was detained, but not for too long.
Does your fame protect you?
Possibly, although I doubt that the Moscow police or the Qatar police knew who I was. But certainly the British passport did. No doubt about it.
Might it protect you in America?
Maybe. I've known Keir Starmer for 40 years. We campaigned together many years ago in the 1980s. Hopefully, if anything bad happens, one of my colleagues will get on the phone to him and hopefully he will sort it. But there's no guarantee with any of this. It's all if and maybe.
What I'm deeply impressed and moved by is your utter commitment that continues despite everything you've been through. Over the years, that unwavering, commitment that you've got, and that fearless nature of it, which I don't think many people would have the ability. So, what would you say? What do you say to young activists now, who reach out to your foundation for help and support? Clearly there are different conditions that exist now. And, for me, you're in the sort of mould of the suffragettes. If we think how brave the suffragettes were, and if we think about, the sort of right for women to vote, it seems bizarre, but they did extraordinary things. And, and I think we should all continue to remember, just how difficult it was to be, to be them. But I mean,
I just said that, people should always never forget that until 1999, Britain had the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet just 14 years later, in 2013, with the advent of same-sex marriage, all those anti-LGBT plus laws had been repealed. That's the most extraordinary, phenomenal, successful law reform campaign in British history. And of course, I was part of it, but I was only one of many. So it's those kind of successes that drives me on today. Having helped bring about those changes, that inspires me to carry on for the next battle. And of course, on top of that, over the last 5 or 6 decades, I've helped at least 20,000 people, some of them refugees fleeing persecution, but lots of victims of miscarriages of justice, discrimination and hate crime, at least 20,000. And the messages I've got back saying, thank you, you've made a difference to my life, you've helped me solve this problem. I just think that no money, no fame, no status or position or award can ever compensate for that. And that just keeps me motivated to drive forward, to help and support more people.
I think you've touched on, which I think is one of the most important things in life, is a sense of purpose. You know, we have to be driven by that sense of purpose. And I think there's something going virally tomorrow about the ban on social media under 16s, and I think there was a young girl on the press last night saying, you know, are you against it? He said, I'm horrified by it. And he said, what are you going to do with all your extra time? And she said, I'm going to stare at the wall. Which, I mean, for a sort of like, you must be at 12 or whatever thoughts, you know, that I go. But to a certain extent, that's where you remind us that our focus is being stolen. And we have to remain on our own polarity and focus and our own sense of purpose, because without that, you know, we're just sort of, I don't know, we're prey to the sort of the giants making trillions on the back of the free data they get from us, you know, which is shocking. So we need to break out of those things. So finally, we've talked about what is your hope? You must have some sense of hope that keeps driving you on. What's the positive things you hold on to, knowing what you've achieved? I can see we've touched on that now, but what is your hope over the next 10, 15 years in terms of the way we see the world going?
Well, first let me say that I am one of life's eternal optimists. You know, I'm also very cognizant of the pitfalls and downfalls and the setbacks. But I see that the march of history is forward, upwards and onwards. But we are in a period of setback, of backlash. I recognize that. We need to challenge that. But ultimately, I'm still very confident that we are going to sort it. You know, with the climate destruction we face, the threat of Russia and other bad actors around the world, you know, it is bleak, but we will get through this. And I just want to do my bit. And I think, you know, I've always been driven by, you know, a sense of, I suppose, basically love, you know, love of other people, love of freedom, justice, equality, those kind of things. And when you have that motivation that's from a place of love, it takes a lot of knocks to not, you know, put you out of that or to set you back. And I suppose I also trace it a bit back to my very devout Christian upbringing. You know, I'm not religious anymore, but my parents, as I said, you know, they were Christian fundamentalists pretty much. But they instilled in me a very important sense that we all have a responsibility for what we do and what we say, and that you know, we have to stand up for what is right. Even my parents used to say, even if everybody else in the world says something, and if it's wrong, go against it, fight it. And they meant that primarily in a religious sense, but I took it to heart in terms of, you know, standing up for what I believe to be right. Now, of course, I acknowledge I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but all I can do is stand up for what I believe to be right. And if we all did that, I think the world would be a better place.
Yeah, we all have the power in our individual actions to make the greater whole. I think we need to cherish that. And very, very finally, a little bird tells me that in the mix at the moment, someone is developing a play about your life. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
I can't say much, but it is true, yes.
Well, I look forward to that. And Peter, thank you.
Can I just say that, again, I'm collaborating, but for me, the collaboration, as with the Hating Peter Tatchell film, is not because I want my name up there in lights. It's because I want to show people that social change is possible, and through my experience, give people clues and ideas on how they can be change makers. So for me, it's about creating an awareness and understanding through film or a play that will motivate others to think, yes, I can change things too. Because we need lots more change makers, not just me.
With that thought, Peter, thank you very much for agreeing to chat with me. And I wish you well, and don't stop. The world needs you.
It's been a great pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much. I'll just finish by quoting my favourite motto, which is, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen.
Great wisdom. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.